Welcome, everyone, to the show. This is another episode of Your Soul's Transformation podcast. I am your host, Dimple Bindra, and today I have the exceptional Dr. Mario Rocha.
Hi, thank you. Nice to be here.
Dr. Mario, it's such a pleasure that you're here on my show today. I have been following your work for quite some time already, and today it's an honor for me to even ask you to even speak on this topic that so many people are struggling with. Our topic today is navigating love and trauma, strengthening couples' bonds in the face of adversity. So, my first question, sir, is I'm curious, how does trauma really show up in the day-to-day life of a couple? It must have some subtle signs, right?
Well, I think for trauma, it shows up in different ways for different people. But there is some kind of overarching themes that might show up. So what I would say is, if we're talking about PTSD, if we're talking about complex PTSD, right? Then we're talking about things that it will show up in it, it will show up in ways that affect everything about an individual. So I think first we have to look at the individual and then how it's connecting with the couple. So with an individual PTSD, for example, we have things called flashbacks. Right. So not only will we have flashbacks where maybe memories of trauma will flash back, some people will have smells that will flash back of trauma. We also have emotional flashbacks, right?
Mhm.
So what that means is a certain conversation or a certain thing that your partner does will trigger a flood of emotions that are connected to our past trauma, right? And we might not understand that that's connected to our past trauma. We just might have a really intense flood of emotion because your partner didn't take out the trash, or, you know, there was an argument over something, disagreement over the kids or whatever it might be. And what I always tell clients is if the emotion feels really intense, if the emotion feels like it's coming from a really deep place, then it's probably an emotional flashback,
Mm.
right? So again, how that shows up for people, it shows up in different ways, right? So some people, um, they're more of a fighter when they get into um, trauma. So they will react in an aggressive way, right? Some people are runners, so they will shut down and they will not engage with their partner, right? Some people just freeze up in the moment. Um, there's another, when we talk about fight, flight, freeze responses, there's another response called fawning, which means I kind of go along with everything my partner says and does because I don't want to upset them, right? And that's connected to past trauma because maybe that's how I survived my abuser, right? So again, it can show up in a whole lot of different ways, um, in sometimes big ways and sometimes small ways. But it really, what I tell clients is it affects all of who we are, right? So trauma affects our biology, our nervous system, right? Our body and how it responds and how it feels. Trauma affects our emotional regulation, right? It affects how we feel and our ability to regulate how we feel.
Mhm.
It affects our self-esteem and our confidence. It affects how we communicate, right? And it affects really if it's severe trauma, but really any kind of severe traumatic event will affect our soul, our psyche, right? We have really deep defenses in the deeper parts of who we are that um, that affect again everything, right? So there's a whole lot of layers to trauma and again how it shows up in relationships.
Thank you for telling us that and enlightening me and our listeners. I'm curious about, you mentioned fighters, runners. You also mentioned people to shut down. And then you used a term. You said there are some people. What was the term again that you
It's
used?
called fawning.
How do you spell it?
Fawning.
And what does that mean? Like literally a
So,
person who would just not react and be like, all right, I'm just gonna go with whatever my partner says.
well, the reaction is to please,
Ah,
right? The reaction is to not create any problems, right? So if the husband gets angry, for example, if the wife is a fawn kind of person, then she'll respond and just go along with everything. Like, oh, it's my fault. She'll take the blame. She will do extra things to make her husband happy, and vice versa. I mean, men do the same thing, right? If they have this kind of response to trauma, then what they're going to do is they're going to feel like they're at fault, so they have to make up for it. They have to please the person, and even if the person is abusing them,
mm,
right? So that's a fawn response.
thank you, doctor. This is
Uh-huh.
great because I feel like even though, so I always knew about the fighters, the runners, and the people who shut down.
Uh,
The fawners, I would call them people pleasers.
yeah, for sure.
And sometimes it starts with home. And I know that as these people go outside and work, then they incorporate or they exhibit the same behavior at workplaces. But
Right.
that's
Yeah.
another podcast.
Right.
Okay. My
Right.
next question is, it's fascinating. And speaking of the signs which you mentioned already, are there any that might just fly under the radar, indicating that one or both the partners are wrestling with some unresolved issues? Can you give us with some examples of like maybe when a couple gets agitated about something in a partner, and I know they're probably getting triggered, and it might be because of something happened in the past, their mom did something or their dad did something, they just see that behavior in their partner and it's hard for them to project. But my question is, what just flies under the radar and we don't even know that these two people have trauma?
Like I said, everybody's a little bit different, but one of the things I noticed in relationships where one or both people have trauma is sometimes there'll be a really big disconnection emotionally between the two, right? Because um, if one of the partners is has some severe trauma, sometimes they don't like to talk about it, right? Especially if they haven't done the work, if they haven't been in therapy, they don't want to remember it. They don't like to talk about it. They don't like anything to bring up that trauma, right? So what they'll do is they'll cut themselves off emotionally, right? But what that feels like for the other partner is maybe they're feeling like they're not loved. They'll create a distance, right? So, um, again, that creates a situation where the other partner might be feeling like, oh, there's something wrong here. They're like, there's something bothering you, but the other partner is not really sharing what's bothering them. So then it's like, again, it either creates no communication, or it creates maybe the partner blaming themselves, like, hey, am I doing something wrong here? Maybe they blame the partner for not loving them or not opening up, right? It just creates a situation where we're not connected and one or both of the partners don't understand what the other one is going through.
Exactly. So we know that vital communication is so important
Mhm.
in a relationship.
Mhm.
And from your perspective, if one person is, let's say, experiencing trauma or has experienced trauma in the past, the other person really didn't or don't really know about the trauma of their partner, what do you think will be the best way to bring these couples back on track?
Yeah, well, one, I think what I always say is individual work, individual therapy is an important piece to couples work. If you're not working on you individually, then it's gonna have a negative impact on the relationship, right? So I would say both people have to realize, okay, we both need individual work, right? At the same time, I would definitely suggest that the partners start reading up on trauma, start listening to podcasts on trauma. So there's books like The Body Keeps the Score. There's a book that I really like called Complex PTSD
Mhm.
by Pete Walker. Um, so there's a lot of books out there about trauma. So I would suggest both partners start educating themselves on trauma and how it affects people in various ways, and and then really start to come from a place of understanding, right? When somebody has trauma, what we have to do is give them space. We have to make them feel safe, right? Even safe with all the bad feelings they might be feeling, with all the the kind of um, we talked about flashbacks, or um, you know, a lot of times people with trauma, they will project their own feelings onto other people, right? They will project their past experiences onto other people. So sometimes we have to create space um, for intense feelings and for that to be okay, right? So um, there's a lot of work for both partners to create a safety net in the home and within the relationship. So that's going to mean a lot of patience, a lot of individual work, and a lot of communication with each other.
You answered it. Can I share an example with you
Yeah.
and maybe you can help? So I had this um, personal client that I was coaching, and this so he was a senior leader in a very big company, and his wife also worked at Amazon, and both of them had a lot of issues whenever they would speak to me individually. So I tried coaching them together, that never worked.
Mm.
So I tried coaching them individually. And it's always whenever I try to tell them, you guys have trauma, you need to do, be create more empathy and be more compassionate towards each other. But my challenge with them was every time I would talk to them individually, the wife is always blaming the husband and the husband is always blaming the wife. So forget about even getting into working on themselves. It was always a very emotional session with the wife. It's always like a fighting session with the husband. He's always about she's doing this and she's doing that, and the wife is like, but I don't feel love, I do so much. So in such relationships where I knew both of them experienced trauma in their past, and sometimes the trauma is from their childhood, and and also the trauma is from each other. They each other are traumatizing themselves living together.
Right.
What would your like one to two advice be in case they listen to this podcast?
Good question. Again, without knowing them in detail, I would say in all of my work, what it boils down to is we are defending ourselves from feeling feelings that we don't want to feel,
Bingo, right
right?
on. You got it. Yes.
So with, for example, the husband, um, blaming the wife or, getting upset or being angry. What we need to do is learn how to feel what we're feeling and tap into what is there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of anger, right? We're not judging that. But where does this anger coming from? Tell me about how anger has affected your life. Let's learn how to sit with the anger. And as we sit and uncover anger, usually anger is a secondary emotion. So we're processing, we might eventually go into hurt and fear and other emotions that anger's kind of masking for,
I
right?
love it. Yeah.
And again, the same with the wife, right? This feeling that she's doing everything and she's not being appreciated. Hey, okay, let's tap into that. Tell me about being appreciated. What is that experience like for you? Hey, and being able to go to the emotion and being able to regulate, right? Because remember, we talked about trauma is we don't know how to regulate what we're feeling in the moment. We don't know how to understand it. So we react in ways to help us cope with what we're feeling and experiencing. So if we can sit with our feelings better, if we can go there and understand why they're there, because they're all there for a reason, right? Then we can work through the feeling. We can get the understanding of the feeling, right? Um, so a lot of times, sometimes people don't want to feel things because they might feel weak, right? They might feel vulnerable. And so what I would say is we have to go there to do the healing, to do the work. And we're not going to stay there, but we have to go there, right?
I love that. Like sitting with yourself. And I say this usually sit with yourself, feel the pain, and then heal the pain.
Right.
I love that. And for those listening who might be in this, traumatic relationship, they themselves experience trauma and they're recreating the trauma with their partners because their partners also have similar trauma or something totally different. What would be something that we can tell them which will just help them to start addressing these issues together without feeling like it's all too much? Because like you mentioned already, sometimes they don't want to even talk about it. They don't
Right.
talk. They want to either fight or they're running away or they're like just keeping quiet and shutting down. But I encourage them to talk about it, like sit down, talk, have compassion, have empathy when you're trying to listen. But what is your advice, doctor?
Well, I think that's good advice. What I would say is it's hard to do that if we don't understand it ourselves. If we don't understand
Mm,
ourselves first, then
mhm.
it's hard to communicate from that place, right? Even like for example, if I'm working with a couple or an individual who's having trouble with empathy, okay, well we don't want to again judge that or blame that. We want to explore that. What is that about? Why is it there? Why can't we connect with empathy? Right? Why can't we connect with others? Right? So again, I would say we want to start working on understanding ourselves first. And the more you can understand yourself, the more you will be able to have empathy with your partner. The the better you will be able to um, communicate with your partner your needs and your desires and be vulnerable, right? So um, again, read books on trauma, start educating yourself. Again, both people do the work individually and then come together and talk about it, right? Read a book together separately and then come together and talk about How did that, what did you get from that book? What did you learn? What came up for you? Right? So I would say we have to make a commitment to do this journey together, right? So if you're in a relationship and you look at it and you say, this is worth saving, this is worth doing the work, then you want to make a commitment. That means, again, making a commitment to go to all those places that you don't really want to go to, right? To have the tough conversations that you don't want to have, to read the books, to open up and be vulnerable. And again, for somebody who's had trauma, that's a scary, scary place to go to. However, get support as well. So again, a good therapist, good coach, a good, um, you know, somebody that's going to be there to support you through the process, I think is also really important.
Yeah, I love that. So, what about, let's talk about, intimacy and connection with your partner.
Mhm.
Keeping the spark alive is tough, especially when people have trauma. But what about when you're dealing with such situations where, like we were talking about trauma again, and how can couples or any tips that you have that how can they really try to increase their intimacy and connection, especially when they don't want to talk, they're fighting all the time, they feel the other person is toxic, they feel like all the problems in the world is started by the partner and their focus is just the partner and therefore they lack intimacy. So any tips on that?
Yeah, well, I would say it always takes two to tango. Hey, if you're in a relationship with somebody, there's two people involved, and both people are playing a role in what is happening in the outcome, right? So I always tell clients, even if the other person is 90% at fault, there's a 10% you're contributing in there somewhere, right? And we
Yep.
have to look at that first. So what I would say is we have to understand what the root is because again, for every couple, it's going to be different, right?
Yeah.
So I've experienced some clients with trauma who, again, their biology is triggered. So they can't get aroused because they are triggered from their trauma and they're having emotional flashbacks. They're feeling unsafe. They're feeling all the feelings from their trauma is flooding them again, right? So that's a thing that where we need to focus on grounding and regulating our nervous system and really tapping into that. And I've seen a lot of that talk in the internet these days, but that's not the complete picture, right? That's only one piece of the puzzle, right?
Mhm.
So when we're talking about intimacy, there's more than just the body. There's feeling safe, right? What other emotions are showing up? So again, for somebody else, it might mean that maybe one person is really critical and that they had a hard time with the critical mother in their life. So they're feeling really hurt or they're feeling really angry or resentful. So the issue with them is emotionally they can't connect. So physically they're not able to connect. So now we have to deal with resentment or the hurt and really learn how to heal that and communicate with each other on that. So again, I think it's really pinpointing what it is, identifying why there's a lack of intimacy, and again, I think it's all rooted in the same thing is we have to feel safe enough to go there. We have to feel safe enough to go to the problem, to express the problem, to give the other person room and time and the patience they need to do the work to heal,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's. That's my thoughts on that. And again, once you do that, then it's just about again communicating needs, communicating, getting back in touch with why did we get together in the first place? What do we love about this person? Getting back to the root of what attracted you to them, or go out and start dating again. How can we create this spark? Because again, a relationship is just like anything else. If you don't put in the work, you're not going to get a result. And that includes intimacy and connection. Like I know, I'm sure this is not true for everyone, but for most men, it's a little easier to get to a place of wanting sexual intimacy, right? If your partner is having a hard time going there, then we need to create an atmosphere for them to feel safe, to allow them to get there. So again, what part am I, instead of blaming my partner that they don't want to have sex, okay, well, what role am I playing that's creating an environment that they might not be feeling safe in? How can I create an atmosphere where they feel safe and they can start to open up emotionally and connect again and, kind of start from there?
I love that. Any last words of encouragement for someone who's listening in?
Yeah, well, I'll say that a lot of times we lose hope when we're going through things, especially with trauma. And, it's really intense. It's really tough. Like I said, when you have experienced trauma in your life, it affects all of who we are. It's really tough work. It's really hard to see in the middle of relationship problems that this can work out. So I would say if there's not abuse going on, right? There's not toxic kind of behavior going on. I would say that anything can be worked out if you put in the work. I've seen really tough cases, really tough situations, really, um, relationships on the brink. I've seen them come back and get better. It's just about the commitment you're willing to make, and are you really willing to go to these tough places we're talking about, right? Individually first, and then as a couple. So I would say get some help, get a good therapist, get a good team around you who will support you in the process. Do a lot of reading, do a lot of educating yourself on how trauma affects you. Things can change. I've seen it happen over and over again. And yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Thank you, doctor. I love that, and I love that advice that we should never give up hope, especially on ourselves first, because if we can
Right.
heal ourselves, then we can definitely be there for the other person, which is our partner.
Right.
So any if you can please tell us, where can our listeners contact you?
Yeah, I think the easiest way might be to go on my Instagram, um, at Dr. Mario Rocha on Instagram. There's a link to a website where I have some blogs, and you can contact me for therapy or any questions that anyone might have. So I'm hoping to do some more writing here too in the future. So that will show up on my Instagram page as well. So I would say, yeah, that will probably be the best bet because you can kind of get to all the links from there.
Awesome. So, listeners, just go to Dr. Mario Rocha on Instagram if you are on Instagram, and we are going to put the link for Dr. Mario Rocha's Instagram on our podcast. Sir, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you on our show.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
And to all our listeners, always remember metamorphosis, not medication. And namaste.